Peace, everyone. Brother Akimba's having a little bit of a technical difficulty um, this morning.
Can you hear me
So,
okay?
yeah, we can hear you.
All right. So welcome to another episode. I'm Akimba, one of the head researchers and writers of We Charge Colonialism.
You're coming out a little. There's some static in the background.
Is there?
Okay, speak now.
Peace. How am I sounding?
Choppy.
Choppy? Okay. I'm going to have to switch devices.
Okay.
So let me switch devices. You can introduce yourself.
Peace. Good morning, everyone. Grand Rising. I'm Natasha, a member of WCC. Member of Northeast Political Prisoners Coalition, Free Them All, and current student and educator. So I hope Brother Akimba is is doing okay. Brother Frank is coming in. Oh, I thought that was okay. So Brother Akimba switching devices, but so I hope everyone is doing well this morning. We have a couple of stories for you, and we will. I mean, we will wait for a second to for Brother Akimba to go ahead and introduce himself. Internet problems.
Okay, good. I'm trying to. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to leave the studio. Can
You did. You're trying to leave the studio. You sound fine now. Are you on a different device?
Yeah, but I'm still. It's coming out of my other phone, so I'm trying to bear with us, everyone. We about to get it together. 1 second. I'm just trying to leave. Okay, here we go. Or if someone can pick me.
Oh, hold on. Let me see.
I just had to turn the other device off. Peace. So again, I thought I saw Frank. Where'd Frank go?
I don't know. He didn't come in. That was you who came the second time. I thought that was Frank too, but
Okay.
he should be coming in soon.
All right. So again, you know how we do. We usually give our weekly roundup before we go into our reading. Today we're reading The Psychopathic, Racial Personality and Other Essays, continuing with the work of Dr. Bobby Wright. I think we spent about 2 or 3 weeks reading Dr. Bobby E. Wright's article on menticide. And so we're going to go into his book. And he's one of our great thinkers. I think he was like really before his time, and a lot more people need to study and learn about Dr. Bobby Wright. So I'm glad we're able to have these conversations and bring his work to you all. So there should be a link for you all to tap on so you can follow us when we get into the book in the second half of the podcast. Before we get into that, I just want to make sure everybody likes and shares the podcast. If this is your first time visiting our channel, make sure you subscribe to We Charge Colonialism so we can get our viewership up and we're able to spread the word to more Africans out there. We Charge Colonialism, a grassroots think tank. And so this is part of the work that we do. You should also visit the website and check out our latest article by one of our sisters, Becca, Wright for Revolution. She's focusing on sort of the history. She's looking at the history of Haiti and how a lot of the contradictions that exist in Haiti now, like looking at that history and the development, and looking at the role of colonizers in Haiti, undermining the governments and undermining Haitian development. So it's a really good article. I think it's about a 12, 14-minute read. So visit our website and check that out, wechargecolonialism.org. All right, so we can get into it. I wanted to pull my story up. I don't know if we can get on the screen. I was having issues with my devices, but I was looking at the Pope.
Oh yeah, I think I should be able to pull it up for you. So just give me a second.
Okay. Yeah, so in this article, it talks about the Pope. He's visiting Congo, and it's interesting. He's calling out the West. He's calling out these colonizers, right? The Pope, and it's interesting too because when we look at the history of colonialism, European presence in the Americas, European presence in Africa, uh, all all of this was instigated by the Catholic Church, by the Pope. The Pope, he issues a series of papal bulls going back to the early 1400s, but the ones in particular that I'll raise right here is Dum Diversas. And Dum Diversas, and was issued by the Pope, right? Dum Diversas said that Europeans, Christian nations can reduce, particularly Portugal and Spain, can reduce non-Christians, pagans, Saracens meaning Muslims, can be reduced to perpetual slavery, right? You can enslave, this is in 1452. And then in 1455, you have the Doctrine of Discovery, where the Pope issues the decree and says Christian nations that come across quote unquote undiscovered land can claim it for themselves. And so even if there's non-Christians there, remember you have a papal bull in Dum Diversas that says you can reduce them to slaves. So, basically you're double trapped for not being Christian. And now not being Christian, you can be enslaved. And now your land can be claimed by the Christian nation as a discovered land. So, but I raised that just to show how, here we are in 2023, and we have the Pope talking about the colonizers exploiting, let me see if I can pull that up, exploiting Africa. If you could, because I'm on my phone, could you read like the first few paragraphs of that?
Yeah, sure. So it says, and I'm gonna read it off of the one that I have pulled up. So it says Pope, the title of the article is Pope slams foreign plundering of Africa as he arrives in the DRC Congo. Pope Francis has demanded that foreign powers stop plundering Africa's natural resources for the, quote, prison of their own greed after he landed in the Democratic Republic of Congo as part of a trip to two African nations. The 86-year-old Pope Francis is the first pontiff to visit DR Congo since Pope John Paul II did in 1985 when the country was still known as Zaire. Hands off the Democratic Republic of the Congo, hands off Africa, Francis said on Tuesday to applause in his opening speech to Congolese government authorities and the diplomatic corps in the garden of Kinshasa's National Palace. Calling Congo's vast mineral and natural wealth a diamond of creation, Francis demanded that foreign interests stop carving up the country for their own interests and acknowledge their role in the economic enslavement of the Congolese people. Stop choking Africa. It is not a mine to be stripped of or a terrain to be plundered, said history's first Latin American Pope, who has long railed, at how wealthy countries have exploited the resources of poor ones for their own profit. Sorry,
Nah, it's cool. The Pope is hilarious, but at the same time, the Pope is there. I appreciate him calling out the West. Don't get me wrong. This is what we do. We call out the West, and with the Pope, maybe the Pope, he puts a stamp on what's happening in regards to these contradictions, right? And in regards to the exploitation and the oppression that's taking place in Africa and against African people all over the world. But this is the conversations that we are having right here on this channel. This is the conversations that people from Malcolm X to Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Kwame Ture, and the list goes on. We've been calling out this oppression, this exploitation, this colonialism. So it's good to hear the Pope say that, but the Pope has his own agenda too. The Pope is there to spread Catholicism. And Catholicism itself is a colonial religion, and when I was looking at the article, if you scroll down, I wish I had it up, but somewhere in the article, it talks about how the Catholic Church is in Africa and it's controlled. I don't know if it's Congo in particular or Africa, but like 60% of like the health facilities, institutions, like they're there with their hands on institutions that African people are dependent on.
Yeah, it says the Catholic Church runs about 60% of health and education services here. It's what makes the Catholic Church such a significant institution here in Congo, Webb added.
So there it is. So, the Catholic
90 million, like about half of the Congo's population of 90 million are Roman Catholic. So about half of that. So you have at least 40, maybe 45 million of them being Roman Catholics.
Serious contradiction. So, I just wanted to raise this story, uplift this story. For one, I mean, listen to the Pope. Pope is calling out what's taking place in Africa. If you don't believe us, hey, the Pope himself publicly said that they're looting the continent publicly, right? But the other part is like not being lulled to sleep by these, words from the Pope, because the Pope is there with his own agenda. They're trying to colonize Africa as well, colonize the minds of African people. So it's more than just the exploitation of the continent's resources. It's the colonizing of the minds of African people, because once you control the minds, everything else, is a given. You can control the body. And actually, Dr. Bobby Wright talks about this. You control the minds, you control behinds. So, we have to fight even against the Catholic Church, who, again, since its inception, has been a colonial force going all the way back to Rome. So, if you had anything you wanted to add, go right ahead.
I mean, I think also like currently think about the way that how racist Italy is. When we think about like migrants, African migrants going over into Italy and how they're treated, and even those African people who are born in Italy, right? And how they're treated there. So one, what is the Pope's stance on that? Because we know Rome is right there in Italy. So even within your own country, what are you saying about the way in which, their immigration policies are, toward African people, and also whatever, and those people who are born within Italy, what are the policies that Italy itself are enacting against those of us who are born over there and who live in Italy. So I think that's one thing. And I also, thinking about the way in which, like you brought up before, the Catholic Church, we know the missionaries and the religious people and those who are the religious institutions as well played huge parts in colonialism and still do. The fact that they say that 60% of their health and education services are coming from the Catholic Church, that is colonialism right there. Why is it that 60% of a country's education and health services are coming, one, from outside of it, 2 from Europeans. That pope is a European. I don't it does, the thing about the way in which the Spanish set up their colonies versus the way the English set up their colonies, have slight differences in the way that the Spanish set up the European Spanish, because Spaniards are Europeans. Spain, they are Europeans as well, set up their colonies in their colonial structure. Have people misunderstanding that in South America, you have white people who live there, black people who live there, those who are mixed, white and black, and those who are mixed, indigenous and African, and so we know that also one of the things that comes out of Latin America is this pushing of what Latin America looks like as white. So they're always pushing forth white Latinos and making you think like, okay, these people are still not, Europeans, as those Europeans here in America. And so Pope Francis, he's still, whether he's the first Latin Pope, he's still a European Pope with European interests, and the Catholic Church is still a European institution with European interests. And that's what they're doing. And the fact that, they're providing the education, they're determining the thoughts and actions of the minds of African minds is a huge, huge issue. And we know that Europeans are notorious for speaking with a forked tongue, saying one thing, but actually, really meaning something else. That they're notorious for lying blatantly and saying things that would make you think that, they're actually moral and have these good intentions when they really don't. I mean, they have shown a history of it, not hundreds of years of history, but thousands of years of history of them doing this, going into countries or taking these stands against what they say is wrong, but actually benefiting from it all along, and also wanting to continue to do the things that they've historically been doing in terms of oppressors and colonizers, but doing it maybe in a slightly different way where people may not recognize it. And if we don't recognize that the Catholic Church running 60% of health and education services in the Congo is colonization, then there's a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, Dr. Bobby Wright, he gets to this type of behavior and what's taking place. Like, what we need to like call out is the menticide that's happening, right? And Dr. Bobby Wright, I wish I was trying to find a book by Baruti and his definition as well. I probably put it so, but
well, if you can take a look, I can do my story, and you can try to look for it.
Okay, go right ahead.
Also, coming into us reading, when we get to the reading in the book. So for my story, I'll pull it up really quickly. Share screen. So the story that I have this morning, that I chose this morning, is about low trade amongst African countries, a worrying signal, is what it says. And so I'll just read a couple of the key things that it's talking about here that really stand out. So the first thing that they talk about is where they say, even as 3 major regional blocs in Africa urge Tanzania, South Sudan, and Democratic Republic of Congo to sign up a trade agreement that will expand their reach, a new report warns trade amongst African nations still remain the lowest globally, with a paltry 5 countries out of 55 carrying out their trade within the continent. Now that is significant. 5 countries out of 55 carrying out trade within the continent. And then it also goes down here
You
to
said
talk about
5 out of
how
55 countries are, what are they doing?
carrying out trade within the continent.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it goes on to also talk about how there are other countries who've signed on to this agreement, which they cover here. So it says that this is despite the implementation of the 1.2 billion strong market under the Continental Free Trade Area in January 2021. So this AFCT, this African Continental Free Trade area that was signed onto in January 2021 was supposed to, the aim is, and it was and still is, to increase the intracontinental trade between countries in Africa. But even though many countries signed up onto it in 2021, it still really hasn't done what it's supposed to do. And even still, it goes on to talk about how trade between countries in Africa has declined even since signing it. So it says this, and this is in comparison, right? This compares unfavorably with Europe, Asia, and Americas, whose intracontinental trade stands at 66% in Europe, 63%, 63.8% in Asia, and 44.4% in America, respectively. So these countries that are going into Africa and setting up these trade deals with them for exports and imports, these main countries that we always hear about, right? The countries in Europe, countries in Asia, America as a country within itself are always setting up export trade deals with these African countries, and also bringing in their companies to take over and create businesses that will also take out of Africa as well. But in the meantime, while they're doing that to African countries, they are having these high percentage of intracontinental trade themselves, where majority of their trade is within their country, or close to the majority of their trade is within their country. And so I bring this up to just think about how necessary it is, and I guess how also dire it is, and I believe African countries recognize this as well, that we really look at how we can increase trade within the African continent, how we can increase movement within the African continent, in order to build up the economy. So we know that some of the reasons why these economies are not as strong as they are within African countries, in order for them to be able to have the types of trade, intracontinental trade that they need, is in a large part because of colonialism. And so when we think about Walter Rodney, and when he talks about how Europe underdeveloped Africa, he talked about how development means like your ability and the capacity for you to have self-sustaining growth. Now, if you can't trade within the continent, how are you going to be able to have self-sustaining growth as a continent? People talk about Africa and its rise and its economies and how they're rising, and how Africa's on the rise, but the way that the fact that the trade within the continent has gone down even after them signing this intracontinental trade agreement, even though the trade within the continent has gone down since them signing it, we still hear a lot of talk about Africa and the rise of Africa, and we have to think critically about that narrative, and also what is happening with this trade amongst African countries. How can you possibly have some type of self-sustaining growth when your growth pretty much is being dictated by outside forces. Is being dictated by China, is being dictated by Europe, is being dictated by America. America is going in there right now, and as we've been reporting on, having and creating trade agreements with African countries. You have European countries still going in there and trying to keep their foothold in Africa. And then you have China, increasing their foothold in this whole idea of building infrastructure. You're building the infrastructure for who? For what? Are you building infrastructure that will allow for exports? Even I think maybe it was last week or 2 weeks ago when we reported on the story about Nigeria building this this huge port, right? And we saw that like the Chinese were there, and that was the Chinese guy was the one being interviewed about this building of this port in Nigeria. And this port is more for export than it is for intra trade. How are you building up your infrastructure for you to be able to trade with other countries? China is focused on building infrastructure within Africa so that they can export things and that they can be able to get the materials out of Africa that they want. But we're not thinking about, as African countries, as African people, how do we build an infrastructure? How do we use our resources to build an infrastructure that, one, provides economically for the people, but also allows the people and the country to sustain itself? And just one last point I'll make on this is that it goes on to say here in terms of what the exports of the country are, and that a lot of African countries really rely on exporting a few key materials that, and let me see if I can find that sentence. But they basically export, their main exports are exports. Okay, here it is. So their economies depend on commodity export, mainly fuels like oil, natural gas, and coal, metal ores, and other minerals. Agricultural commodities play on average a less important role, although there are expectations such as exports of coke. Although there are exceptions such as exports of cocoa beans by the Ivory Coast. And so these exports, even the exports that the country's economies are heavily relied on, are ones like oil, natural gas, and coal. And what are those? And those particular types of exports are ones that the European countries are wanting and needing. And so everything that Africa produces is still being determined and controlled, not by what their people need, not by what the country needs, not by what the continent needs, but by what these outside European countries need. And so we have to really be clear and think about, when they're talking about the rise of Africa, when they're talking about the development of Africa and where Africa is going, where is it going, where, for who? Because clearly, when we look at the trade within Africa and the reasons why the intercontinental trade is difficult, it's not the rise of Africa and African economies is not benefiting the continent, but it is benefiting outside European countries.
Hey, that's the contradiction with colonialism. African people producing for the lives of the colonized, for Europeans, white folks who are, Europeans, right? These people have made a living off of the blood, sweat, and tears of African people, our labor. And so, that's why, Chairman Malik Yesateli talks about it being a parasitic system. It's a parasitic system. They're able to live off of the work of African people, off of our resources. So that's the contradiction. This, as you were speaking, I spoke about this before in another podcast in regards to just using cocoa as an example of what you're talking about, right? Where there's this what you call external trade that's taking place where internally Africans who could be trading, producing for themselves, don't necessarily have to deal with Europeans, right? Or even the Chinese. But this relationship is so deep. So South Africa, listen to me here. They import this. This is 2020. I'm just going to read this. In 2020, South Africa imported 16.6 million in cocoa powder. All right, and cocoa powder, becoming the 36th largest importer of cocoa powder in the world. At the same year, cocoa powder was the 484th most imported product in South Africa. South Africa imports cocoa powder primarily from Malaysia, Indonesia, Netherlands, Spain, and Singapore. That's where South Africa is importing its cocoa from. Did you hear me name one African nation? Malaysia, Indonesia, Netherlands, Spain, and Singapore. So where's Ghana at? Where's the Ivory Coast at? They're producing 48% of the cocoa in the world, 40 to 50% is coming from Ghana and Ivory Coast. Why are they importing outside of Africa? So this is a serious contradiction. And so what happens, Africans have been caught up all over the world, on the continent, us in the US, wherever we are, in the islands, South Europe, South America, we're caught up in an economic relationship where we have this dependency on Europeans because I don't know, this is fair to break from them, but you know what it is, Natasha? It's a trust factor. It's the trust factor. And we have African people we have to be good on what we say. We have to trust each other when we go into business deals because the European has these resources. And the last thing we need is, hey, as an African nation, I come to another African nation and say, hey, we're only going to trade with each other. But then the European comes in and undermines that and strikes a business deal with companies and corporations within the country that I'm running, and I'm allowing that to happen, then, that's undermining our relationship as African people. So there will be some sacrifices. You might not be able to make as much capital as you was in dealing with the European by trading with other African nations until we begin to build and get all the African nations into the fold. But this is what we have to do to be examples to other African nations. Hey, we're doing it. It's a sacrifice, but we're doing this for the liberation of African people, liberating ourselves from European colonialism. And so this is the idea. So last thing I want to say before we move on, look into the open door policy. I think it was President William McKinley. He was the president. This is going back to the 1890s. They had an open door policy in China. At least he was pushing for this open door policy in China because China was a large market. And these colonizers were looking to exploit the Chinese market, right? They have been exploiting them for a long time, but America wanted to get in on that. So they came with this open door policy where all nations, European colonizer nations, could go into China and be able to do trade and business deals. So I bring that up because I want you to just think about this. That's a microcosm of what the Europeans have done around the world with this open door policy. When they're talking about free trade, they're talking about the freedom to come into African nations and exploit those African nations and African people. Open your doors, open your borders, and let our companies come in and do it. And so we get caught up. They created this whole international system to allow them to be able to do that. That's what the IMF is for. That's what the World Bank is for. That's what the World Trade Organization is for. And so if we don't have these conversations and become conscious of this, and then make sure that we do what's necessary to dismantle these systems or at least create our own systems so we're not dependent on those systems, then we're going to find ourselves running in circles, a colonial circle. But I'll leave it right there. So we're going to move on to the reading. But before we do that, we want to just make everybody conscious, aware of our Black Power Fund. So we're going to pull up the promo.
Ever wonder whether it's worth the time and effort, not to mention money, to grow your own food when it's so easy and convenient to just buy what you need at the grocery store? Here are 4 research-backed reasons you should seriously consider growing an edible garden this year. The cost of groceries has jumped more than 13% since January 2022, and price surges are still happening due to inflation. What kind of crops are worth your time? It helps to start with how much they cost at the market. Price tend to fluctuate based on the season, geographic location, and environmental factors like drought or disease. But generally, these items are easy to grow. Tomatoes, bell peppers, leaf lettuce, and other leafy greens like kale and chard. Summer squash, including zucchini, beans, greens, herbs, spinach, beets, cucumbers. Food you grow is guaranteed to be fresh. About 30% of fresh vegetables and 55% of fresh fruits sold in the United States come from overseas, and those numbers continue to grow. That means they travel many hundreds or thousands of miles to reach your grocery store in trucks, trains, and ships. How fresh do you think all that produce really is by the time it lands on your table? For example, this is why your red, supposedly ripe supermarket tomatoes are still rock hard when you buy them and taste like styrofoam. Commercially grown produce often lacks nutrients and are loaded with pesticides. It's always wise to reduce or moderate your consumption of fruits and vegetables that are known to be vigorously treated with pesticides. The numbers are fairly shocking if you've ever thought about it. For example, strawberries may contain as many as 45 pesticide residues. Celery may contain as many as 64 pesticide residues. Cucumbers may contain as many as 86 pesticide residues. Sweet bell peppers may contain as many as 53 pesticide residues. Spinach may contain as many as 54 pesticide residues. Gardening is simply good for your health. Growing your own garden is worth it because you are worth it and your family is worth it. We want to help. Just a $10 application fee gives you an opportunity to win $500. Enter today. First drawing will be April 5th, 2023. Links to the registration form are available on our website at WeChargeColonialism.org under the Black Power Fund tab, or simply type bit.ly/3J57M99. Please check our website under the Black Power Fund tab for tips and tricks on getting started with your garden. Get started today.
Peace. Yeah. So that's the Black Power Fund. Visit our website, WeChargeColonialism.org. If you yourself are a gardener, you know any gardeners, farmers, make sure that you enter or let those people, make them aware, and so that they can enter and be able to win the sweepstakes. So it's about supporting, African people. To support African people who are, feeding themselves and feeding the people. Because this is one thing the colonizer took from us, right? The land, so we weren't able to feed ourselves. And so now we depended on them to feed us. Man, we could talk about this stuff all day.
Like in the story that I reported, right? It talked about how agriculture was the least thing that even in Africa, that agriculture plays like the smallest role in what they produce.
That land, oh my Lord, all that land we got over there in Africa.
Yeah, exactly. And that's so.
Yeah, serious contradiction. So we're going to get into the reading. Dr. Bobby E. Wright, The Psychopathic Racial Personality and Other Essays. And so we're starting from the first chapter or first page, The Psychopathic Racial Personality. For those who want to follow along with this, there should be a link for you. Just tap on that link.
I don't think we put a link for that in the chat.
No.
So if we can go ahead and put that link for them in the chat, that would be good.
Okay. Do we need that link? I'm on my phone, so I can't get it. It should be in the chat, though, but
it'll be put in the chat.
We'll try to get that to you as soon as possible, but we're going to jump right into the reading. So, psychopathic racial personality. In a bullfight, after being brutalized while making innumerable charges at the movement of a cape, there comes a time when the bull finally turns and faces his adversary, with the only movement being his heaving bloody sides. It is believed that for the first time, he really sees the matador. This final confrontation is known as the moment of truth. For the bull, this moment comes too late. The experience of Black people all over the world presents an analogous situation. For hundreds of years, Blacks have been charging at the banners that are held by the European white matadors. Those banners have been represented by concepts such as democracy, capitalism, Marxism, religion, and education. The banners remain constant as long as Blacks were assets. However, with technology and worldwide industrialization on the rampage, resulting in the further exploitation of Africa's resources, which in turn produces an increase in Africa's and Blacks' national consciousness, Blacks are now a threat and a liability to the white race. Therefore, the banner held by the matador represents only one concept: genocide. As a consequence, the major research that white scientists are involved in today is genocidal in nature. Nuclear warfare, population control, medication control, genetic engineering, psychosurgery, electrical stimulation of the brain, and the highly complex science of behavioral technology. Indeed, it is Blacks' moment of truth. It is time for Blacks to look at the matador. This presentation is based upon the following very simple premise. In their relationship with the Black race, Europeans or whites are psychopaths, and their behavior reflects an underlying biologically transmitted proclivity with roots deep in their evolutionary history. The psychopath is an individual who is constantly in conflict with other persons or groups. He is unable to experience guilt, is completely selfish and callous, and has a total disregard for the rights of others. This premise is supported by overwhelming scientific evidence. I mean, scientific evidence, historical evidence, all types of evidence is out there in regards to this relationship. But just to go back, just want to stop for a second. He talks about, Dr. Bobby Wright is talking about the banner that's being waved, right? Well, he uses the bull analogy, right? In this moment of truth. And he's using that as an analogy to describe the experience or the relationship between African people and Europeans. And it's interesting, the matador, when he talks about the banners, he says democracy, capitalism, Marxism, religion, and education. This is what's been used, right? To keep us distracted, to keep us focused. We've been looking at, we've been looking at these different concepts, being distracted by these different ideas that the European has presented, not understanding, what the true problem is. So all we have to do is look at the enemy, the person who's holding up these ideas and concepts that's constantly coming to us talking about democracy. All of this hypocrisy that they're talking about, right? These ideas of capitalism. Do this and you can liberate yourself. Understand Marxism and you can liberate yourself. But the fact is that the European, the one is a material, relationship that we have with the European, and he's using these ideas to keep us confused. So, I'm just looking at these distractions. I wonder what your thoughts are on it, but I think it's important. One of the things to take away from this is understanding like not getting caught up in these different theories and ideas, because sometimes we lose time. We lose time debating on strategy and problem when innately we see the problem every day. We understand what the problem is. And there's another. So the last point, he talks about the matador. Now the banner represents only one concept: genocide. Right. So, that's powerful. And he gets into all of the changes that are taking place with industrialization. There's no need for the African anymore. Before we needed to be distracted. We needed to be confused and controlled in order for them to continue to oppress and exploit us. So as long as we debating and fighting over ideas and so forth, they can continue to exploit us. But now with the technology and industrialization, AI and all of these things, do we really need the African anymore? And so this goes back to what he talks about with menticide. And we had this conversation before in one of our spaces. We were talking about menticide. And menticide is the deliberate destruction of the mind, of a person's mind. So it's the deliberate destruction of the African mind with the objective of extirpation. That's what Dr. Bobby Wright says, to eliminate African people altogether. And so that's the point we're at now, is where our actions, mental-suicidal actions, when we talk about the violence that is committed in our community against each other, that's mental-suicidal behavior. Where is that coming from, right? And when there's nothing done about it, it's because the idea is for those people to for us to wipe ourselves out so that they can come in and just gentrify our communities. And I'm gonna stop here because I know you got some stuff to say, but it's a lot.
I think definitely just to even add on to that, right? When we think about all of the ways in which genocide can happen, right? One of the things I know that we talk about is ethnic cleansing. When we talk about gentrification, we don't refer to it as gentrification. We refer to it as ethnic cleansing because of the systematic way in which it's being done. And when we think about even the ways in which you could wage war upon a people, through the medicine, through the food, through the education system, menticide, what you're talking about. So all of these ways we know that we're being attacked, and it goes to his point, right? Yeah. So, that white, and we're not looking at it that way. We're still looking at it, right? When he talks about the banner, that being held up as, democracy, capitalism, Marxism, religion, education, we're still looking at the banner as that and not as genocide. And he's talking about this, and he's talking about this like 30 years ago. He's talking about it as genocide. But today we're still looking at the other banners as really what America, but also these other European countries around the world because they're still interconnected in that specific kind of way when it comes to the outcomes of what the world is to look like. Europeans are still deciding what the world is to look like, what the future is to look like. And so when we're thinking about these banners and that he brings up, we're still looking at those as that and not really understanding that all of the things that he then mentions here when he talks about the banner as being genocide. And so, white scientists, they are looking at currently, and we know this, nuclear warfare, population control, as huge as it is. When we think about Bill Gates, people still trusting Bill Gates, even looking at him as an authority on anything. I mean, when we know the research has been done to what he's done in Africa, what he's done in Haiti. I mean, the whole foundation, right? His whole Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is still looked upon as a go-to place, right? That is doing right in the world. Medication control, like he talks about, genetic engineering. We know that's happening. I mean, now we have foods that are GMOs, and we know what GMOs do to you. So all of this stuff that he's talking about, it's literally right in our face. But we still, for some reason, think we're fighting for democracy. And not that we should be fighting for democracy and not for our survival as a people. Democracy is not going to bring you and especially the democracy they're talking about. That's not even, democracy. Let's even think about that concept of democracy, because when they throw it out there, they're talking about a particular one that you're not necessarily talking about. So yeah, those, that's what I would add on to what you were saying, because I completely agree.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to get into more. We need to do a 3 hour. We're gonna do a whole episode on just this book, so we can have some time to really get into it. I'm gonna just go to the next paragraph. I'm on page 2, the second paragraph. There is scientific dictum which states everything that exists in some amount, and if it exists, it can be measured. One of the best methods that can be used to measure the psychopathic traits of the white race is observing and analyzing their universal overt behaviors and attitudes towards blacks. However, in doing, since blacks have been enslaved and colonized by whites, a very subtle psychological problem is posed of which every black should be aware. Intellectual insight about whites does not ensure that there will be a corresponding change in blacks' behavior and attitude toward whites, particularly when there is a threat involved. For example, everywhere one finds whites and blacks in close proximity to each other, whether it is Chicago or Zimbabwe, the whites are in control. Yet, blacks rarely question this extraordinary universal phenomenon which defies every known statistical law of probability. In fact, blacks denounce those who simply raise this question with admonitions such as, we should not be racist, and treat them as they have treated us. In fact, whites are not going to allow blacks to treat them as they have treated blacks, so that requires no discussion. However, the subject of black racism should be discussed. A functional definition of racism could be the oppression and exploitation of people because of their race. Using this definition, it is very clear that at this point in time, blacks cannot be racist because of their lack of power to oppress anybody. Black intellectual enlightenment does not always lead to genuine insight, and it can be very damaging to the intellect as reflected by the behavior and attitudes of many eminent black scientists. For example, Dr. Kenneth B. Clark has spent his life making a fortune studying the victims of white oppression, his own people, and now speak of the irrelevancy of color. Dr. Alvin Poussaint, who seems to be Johnson Publishing Company's psychiatrist in residence, ignores the widespread genocidal programs directed against blacks and writes such trivia as the difference between sex and love, blacks and Jews, and the appeal for unity, and why blacks kill blacks. I'm gonna read one more paragraph. Blacks kill blacks because they have never been trained to kill whites. Therefore, it is outside their experience. Historically, the European system has encouraged the killing of blacks. But because blacks have been led to believe that they are a part of the psychopath system, they simply follow the practice. Dr. James Comer is another black psychiatrist whom the psychopaths have so overwhelmed that he has moved, as his book suggests, beyond black and white. Cobbs and Greer follow this tradition of blacks studying themselves rather than their oppressors by concluding in Black Rage that whites make blacks so mad that they kill themselves. Oh, man.
That's a lot. That's a lot there. I know.
Yeah, I was trying to think where to begin.
I think even for me, like, one of the things I think is important about the book and thinking about all of the things that he brings up is paragraph the paragraph at the beginning of page 2. I mean, the second paragraph at the beginning of page 2, where it says, this presentation is based upon the following very simple premise: in their relationship with black race, Europeans, whites are psychopaths when it comes to their relationship with black people, and their behavior reflects an underlying biologically transmitted productive proclivity with roots deep in their evolutionary history. The psychopath is an individual who is constantly in conflict with other groups or persons. He is unable to experience guilt, is completely selfish and callous, and has a total disregard for the rights of others. This premise is supported by overwhelmingly scientific evidence. And he, so I think that his premise that he's bringing up is really important to think about, because then he, I think he talks about like, and I think it's, I don't know if it's in this section or he goes later to talk about like, how like a psychopath, they can interact in a way that you would never know. And he talked about how like most psychopaths live their lives and you would never know that they're a psychopath. And when he talks about how the acts, right, how one is in constant fighting and in constant conflict with groups and persons, and that they are unable to experience guilt, selfish and callous, and is a complete disregard for the rights of others. When we think about the relationship that white people and black people have had, the way that, white people have interacted with black people, everything that he's saying here is what we see when he talks about there's overwhelming evidence. Even today, when you look at what is happening today, it's those same things. The complete disregard for the rights, for your rights, the constant conflict when it comes to everything. Every area of our lives is in constant conflict with a white supremacist institution or a white supremacist, what's the word I'm looking for? Barrier. Because every area of our lives, we're in constant conflict, whether you're going to work and you have to deal with the people who are at your job that with microaggressions and racism and all this other stuff. When you go into school, and that's a constant conflict with teachers. And, we talked about last week, and now it's happened. And and there's some stuff that has happened in New York around the ethnic studies, AP African-American studies courses. Like everything is always in constant conflict. For you to get everything is a conflict for black people within this white system and dealing with it. We're talking about police, murdering black people, all of that. So I think that his analysis and his premise that he raises here is something to really think about in terms of the way that we have historically seen whites interact with black people, but also currently.
Yeah, just to build on that, going back to that that paragraph that you read, the first paragraph on page 2, one of the thoughts that elicited was how black people, we need to be diagnosing the European. They can't diagnose themselves. And this is what a black social theory, this is why it's so significant. Because now when we're looking at this relationship, not through the gaze of the European, we can critique the behavior, we can define the behavior through our experiences as African people. The European he's not going to indict himself. He's not going to diagnose his behavior as being psychopathic because he benefits from the behavior. He doesn't. He's not going to. What's the word? He's biased. He's biased, right? But the African can look at that, and we can define which we should be doing, defining the relationship and defining our oppressor and their behavior on us. So that, I think that was a good point right there. And so, yeah, if we call, hey, the psychopaths, racism is a mental disease. Now, we can talk about, hey, these people need help. We need to get away from these people. We can start having those conversations. Who wants to integrate with a psychopath? Who wants to be a part of a system with that is being ran by psychopaths? Nobody, right? But we're not having that conversation. And I'll just go to the last one. I know we're at the top of the hour. The last paragraph, he talked about the racism too, but just going into the last paragraph, and there was a point also made in the comments about us looking at or diagnosing our problems and looking at the world through, again, the white gaze and the white experience, which we can't do. We can never get that right, because Just like they can't be in our shoes, we can't be in their shoes. These are two different worlds. There's a human experience, but the experiences for people are different, depending on where they are in that power relationship. And so when we have these apologists for the system of colonialism, capitalism, such as Dr. Kenneth B. Clark, and I think that was a great point he talked about. He spent his life making a fortune studying the victims of white oppression and his own people, white oppression on his own people. And now he speaks of the irrelevancy of color. How can you study this stuff all your life and now you're just like, color is irrelevant, right? After making money off of this. But that's what capitalism does too. You begin, once you're able to benefit from the system, you start you become quote unquote colorblind, right? And then you become this person who says, hey, I was able to make it. If I can do it in this system, then, anybody else can do it. So, I just wanted to point out that contradiction, because that goes all the way back to a conversation I had before about the, sort of this buffer in the Black community that goes back to even slavery, where there was opportunities, quote unquote, opportunities for Black people within the system where they're able to become even slave masters in the system, where they can own slaves, right? They can own property. And so because there was a few Blacks that can do that, it blinds, or let's say it sort of deludes the masses of African people to thinking that the system could work. All we have to do is just act a particular way and think a particular way. And so now, we look to try to speak as proper as possible. We look to go to the most distinguished schools. So I'll leave it there. I know we're past the hour, but wanted to see if you had any last thoughts too.
I think my final thoughts on this is going back to, I think what's currently still in the news, even though I'm, haven't been following it much. So it relates to, what might be on people's minds. And so I'll just point out two things and then we'll, and those will be my final thoughts. So I think one, when we're talking about here, right, about this premise that he makes about, in their relationship with the Black race, Europeans are psychopaths. And where he says, like, people, he says, like, in fact, Blacks denounce those who simply raise the question of, like, oh, why do, white people have to, why is it in the area where there are majority Black people that whites run everything, and that if somebody was to bring this question up, that they would be admonished for it, right, and denounced. And so I think also in this premise, I think people would do the same thing, right, with this premise that he brings up. So I think I would like for, even people who watch the replay to talk about what do they think about this premise that he's bringing forward, right? Because I think that is something that we have to, really think about and think through as he's talking about. There's like countless of examples of what he's talking about, but still I say that, just as people would be admonished for, questioning why is it that in an all Black area, you still have, non-Blacks being the ones who run, whether it's who run things, whether it's in politics or in business. And then I think the other part, the last thing I'll say is when it comes to, what's currently going on within, I think, the conversation that's still in the media about the cops having killed the Black guy, and thinking about this paragraph. I mean, thinking about that makes me think about this particular paragraph that he talks about, that Blacks kill Blacks because they have never been trained to kill whites. Therefore, it is outside their experience. Historically, the European system has encouraged the killing of Blacks. Because Blacks have been led to believe that they are part of the psychopathic system, they simply follow the practice. And so I think that is key to thinking around what, those Black cops and the way in which they interacted with and killed that brother last week.
Yeah, Ashe. And we're going to continue to build on it because that was mental suicidal behavior that we witnessed with those police officers. And so this is what we have to understand. Start using this language too. Mental, call it out. This mental suicidal behavior. And these are Africans who need help. We have a lot of Africans who are, behaving in a genocidal way as a result of this type of thinking. So with that being said, man, I want to appreciate all you guys for sticking in, being a part of this conversation. Glad you was here with us. Continue to, share this program as we continue to have these discussions. Want to introduce different books and ideas to you guys. A lot of people haven't been exposed to Dr. Bobby E. Wright. So hopefully, we're able to expose more and more people to these ideas. So with that being said, make sure you visit the website again, wechargecolonialism.org. Apply for the Black Power Fund if you're qualified. And, we'll build with you guys next week. So peace.
Peace.